about the Second Great Awakening. And I told you last week that this was going to start off a new theme, and the theme is religion, evangelical religion in the antebellum period, the Second Great Awakening, this big influx of people into the churches and the sort of penetration of the importance of religion into all aspects of American life is really important. I mean, that's why we spend 2 lectures on this, one on the Second Great Awakening itself, and then the second lecture, which I will give on Thursday, will be about the way in which these religious feelings impacted reform movements and Americans' daily lives. So, okay. The Second Great Awakening, it's called that because we already studied the First Great Awakening, and as you guys know, historians are not so great at coming up with creative names for things. The Second Great Awakening, as we will see, starts in the late 1700s and goes right up through the 1850s. It is geographically sort of diverse in that, you know, it starts off in the north, it sweeps down to the south by the 1850s. And we're really dealing with an evangelical Protestant movement that puts religion at the center of everyday life. It's a revivalist movement. It is extremely emotional. Religious rhetoric pervades the thoughts and actions of everyday people. All right, so here you see an evangelical preacher, and what's going on in the audience?
They're either falling asleep or they're fainting.
Yeah, it's more likely that they're fainting, they're overcome with emotion, because you can tell from the way in which this preacher is kind of standing off center. He's kind of standing in a diagonal way, that he's being very energetic, and everybody else is reacting emotionally. So this is showing a kind of emotional side of the Second Great Awakening. How does this picture contrast with the one that we just saw?
Everybody's sitting upright, they're attentive.
Yeah, it's really quiet compared to the first one. I mean, look, even the trees in this first one, well, you can sort of see them in the background. They're all wavy. And even the trees are, you know, quiet and calm here. Everybody's still outdoors, but they're sitting really calmly with their hands in their laps. All right, so what was the Second Great Awakening? Well, it was a series of revivals, a series of religious meetings and changes in religious ideologies that was unique due to the sheer size of the movement. It begins in New England in the 1790s, and then sweeps through Western New York. And then by the 1850s, it has gone to the South. And so all through the United States, people, Protestants, were swept up in this great religious fervor. There was a huge growth in church membership. That's how we can measure the Second Great Awakening. There were these ripples of enthusiasm. There was a big one in 1826. There was another one in 1831. And church membership doubled between 1800 and 1835. This was a time period where if you wanted to show your commitment to religion, you joined the church, had your name put down on the church rolls. And that's a way that historians can know what was actually going on here. The ideological differences from the First Great Awakening are pretty large. The First Great Awakening, as I said, took place within the context of Calvinistic Protestantism. People still believed in predestination. The First Great Awakening was really just a division between people who preached emotionally, like Jonathan Edwards, whose sermon we looked at, and people who were more orthodox in their preaching. But the Second Great Awakening was completely different. By this time, people were no longer Calvinist. There were a large number of Christian sects in the United States. And believers believed that there was something that they could do to precipitate their salvation, that you weren't necessarily just kind of consigned from birth to be a saint or to be a person who was going to hell, but rather there was a series of steps that you could take. Conversion took place through repentance in huge revival meetings, many of which were outdoors. So the 3 pictures that I've showed you have showed these outdoor meetings. And the entire congregation would focus their energies on the sinners waiting to be saved. So in contrast with Puritanism, faith was not enough. You had to publicly display that you were moral. Good works didn't actually buy you salvation, but they were testimony to the fact that you had experienced this sort of second birth that was essential to the Second Great Awakening. So it is a much more individually oriented, you can do something to promote your own salvation kind of an ideology compared with the First Great Awakening. And as I said, there were evangelicals who were Methodist, who were Baptist, there were Presbyterian ones in New England. So there's just a profusion of sects or divisions of Protestantism. And as I'm going to be talking about, also the creation of entirely new churches or religions in this period. Okay, questions so far?
What year did you say this started?
It's normally pegged as starting in 1795 at Yale University, that the minister there gave a speech that kicked off the Second Great Awakening. But it really picks up in the 1820s in Western New York and then continues on through the 1850s in the South.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Any other questions? All right, well, historians trying to explain the Second Great Awakening, a lot of them turn to what I would call functionalist explanations of why this happened and why it happened when it did. A functionalist explanation is asking, what function did the Second Great Awakening play within the society? What aspects of the society kind of pushed people to become more religious? A lot of the revival meetings of the Second Great Awakening and a lot of the enthusiasm for religion occurred on the frontier. We're still dealing in the 1820s with a frontier that's not very far west, but it is a sparsely populated frontier where people may live many miles from their neighbors. Women especially were kind of isolated in the inland states. There might not be very many women around for them to have a social circle with. So historians think that on the frontier, this kind of enthusiasm, religiously speaking, played a social function by being one of the only things tying the community together. So they would get together for revival meetings that took like a week at a time, and they would camp, and women would have a chance to develop social relationships with each other. The Baptists were particularly popular along the frontier because they had a very simply organized church. They really emphasized the equality of all men and women before God, regardless of wealth or social standing or education. So Baptists were common in the frontier, Second Great Awakening, and so were Methodists. The Methodists had a system of sending out preachers called circuit riders who would ride a pre-mapped circuit of frontier cities and hold religious meetings. So evangelical preachers were reaching out to frontier audiences. Some historians have seen the Second Great Awakening as a conservative movement to impose social control over a workforce that was becoming more and more divergent in its goals and actions from, let's say, the middle class. One of the books that was written about this that has become very important was written by a guy named Paul Johnson. It's called A Shopkeeper's Millennium. And he was writing about the town of Rochester, New York. So Rochester is in upstate New York. And it was a town that was growing quickly as a result of the market revolution that I talked about in lecture 14. It was an entrepot, a place for the exchange of goods, primarily a mill town. It was a boom town that was starting to lose its small town character. And over time, it was becoming a blue collar city. What started off as a mill town started to get other factories in it. Only 21% of the men in town were independent proprietors, that is, store owners or masters of industries. So, 80%, I guess, of the men were working for somebody else. Within Rochester, the de-skilling that I talked about was beginning to erode the social status of working people. And middle-class people were moving out of working-class neighborhoods so that the opportunity for employers to see what their employees were up to in their off hours was increasingly not happening. And working people in their off time were doing things that their bosses wouldn't approve of, like fighting, drinking. Drinking was extremely important in the early republic, not just because water wasn't safe to drink in many places, but also because pubs or saloons served a super important social function. Pubs provided men with an opportunity to get out of their overcrowded homes, homes that also served as workspaces for women and children. Pubs provided not only liquor, but a place to get warm, a comfortable chair, a public bathroom. These were aspects of drinking culture that middle-class people couldn't really appreciate, and they simply classified drinking as sinful. In addition, there was a political movement rising up in Rochester that was attacking one of the central social clubs of the middle class, which was the Masonic movement. You probably heard of the Masons. The working class people in Rochester formed a movement called the Anti-Masons. They thought that the Masons were conspiratorial, sort of deep state functionaries who not only had secret rituals, but also murdered people that wanted to expose those rituals. So conspiratorial thinking goes way back in American history. There was a man named William Morgan, a stonemason, who came to Rochester in 1822 to work on an aqueduct. When the work ran out, he moved to another place in upstate New York and asked the Masons for a job. But when they didn't give him a job, he wrote a long expose of their movement. And once it came out that he was going to publish their secrets, he was kidnapped, he was imprisoned, and then he disappeared forever, probably murdered. All right, so the anti-Masons, this movement, cohered against wealthier people in Rochester. They turned themselves into a political party, and employers were increasingly concerned about these kinds of activities among their working people. So when revivalism reared its head in Rochester, employers were super psyched because they saw this as a way of being able to control their workforce, which was increasingly becoming an uncontrollable workforce. The revival movement gave employers a basis for demanding better behavior from their workforce, demanding that they not drink, that they show up on time to work, that they not be absentee, that they not engage in domestic violence, you know, all things that they had been noticing happening in the workforce. So to put it another way, according to Paul Johnson, belonging to the Second Great Awakening, or like investing your energy in the Second Great Awakening, was not in the best interest of working people, but it was something that was imposed on them by their employers. Okay, so that's explanation number 2. Before I move on to explanation number 3, are there any questions? Because I know that was pretty complicated. Okay, hearing none. The third explanation is not really as much of a functionalist explanation. It kind of takes the Second Great Awakening more on its own terms and says what appealed to people about the Second Great Awakening. And we have to notice that this was a time of great economic change in America. It was a time of great personal mobility as people were moving west. It was a time when young people were moving away from their homes and their families. And this provided, the Second Great Awakening, like belonging to a religious community, provided people with hope for social regeneration at this time of great economic change. It provided people with the hope of changing the world in a good way. So these are various explanations for the Second Great Awakening. I kind of like the third one best because I think it treats the people who participated in the Second Great Awakening as agents of their own fortune, you know, as people who were not the pawns of other people, but knew what they were doing. But that's neither here nor there. Okay. Participation in the Second Great Awakening was very widespread, especially in Western New York, which came to be known as the burned over district. So on fire for God were the people of Western New York. A great example of a revivalist preacher in this period is Charles Grandison Finney. Charles Grandison Finney, the most influential American evangelist in the 19th century. Finney was from upstate New York. He was raised in a not very religious home, and he became a lawyer. He set up a law practice in Adams, New York. And he went to church, but he was not really into it. He didn't, you know, have a very strong belief. But one day when he was attending church, he heard other parishioners praying for revival, for God to bring them a revival of religion. Some of the young people in the church began to look at him, noticing his skepticism on his face, and to pray directly on his account, pray directly for his salvation. And he found this to be very, very unnerving. He was plagued by conscience. He felt like he was a sinner. He couldn't eat or sleep. So he fled to the woods and he thought about his sinfulness. And then he had what he called a mighty baptism of the Holy Ghost. And the next day he announced, "I have a retainer from the Lord Jesus Christ to plead his case." So he went to seminary, he was ordained, and for the next decade, he became really the most skilled evangelical preacher in the burned over district. Now, what made Charles Finney such a major innovator in the world of American religion? Well, first of all, meetings lasted a long time. Revival meetings would last at least a week, giving people a lot of time to experience the sort of pressure of other people, praying for them and to kind of get into the spirit of the thing. The meetings were often held outdoors because they were very, very large meetings that could have several hundred or even 1,000 people at a time. He used something called the anxious seat. This was an area at the front of the revival tent where people who were contemplating their sinfulness and thinking about converting or, joining the church would sit there and the whole audience would pray for them and kind of put them on the spot. He spoke off the cuff. He didn't have like super prepared sermons, but he was a great extemporaneous speaker. He, as a lawyer, was good at arguing. He gesticulated a lot. He would talk about sinners using the confrontational you, like you sinners, blah, 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 instead of talking about sinners as them. He would describe people falling into hell and like gesture with his hands, and people would actually turn around and look as if they could actually see what he was talking about. He and his wife Lydia also visited the unconverted at home, and they started off with the people in the community who were the most important. So employers, political figures, so that then there would be a kind of peer pressure. Prayer meetings were held in schools and in businesses and in people's homes. And in one 6-month period alone in 1839, Finney was responsible for 100,000 people joining the churches. Okay, so the impact on average people included not just, people coming to church or claiming to be Christians or having their children baptized in the church, which was a big concern for a lot of women, but it also changed their ideas about the world. For example, it changed a lot of people's feelings about drinking. So a lot of working men for whom drinking had been an integral part of the culture joined the temperance movement to either stop drinking entirely or to swear off of hard liquor. People saw poverty not as a structural factor of the economy, but rather as kind of like a manifestation of somebody's individual sinfulness and lack of morality. Okay, so if you were a person in the Second Great Awakening, you would have a lot of ideological shifts as a result of your religious beliefs. Questions so far? Nope. All right, so what were some of the impacts of the Second Great Awakening? Well, first of all, women were some of the most involved in the Second Great Awakening. They were involved in getting their husbands and families and those of others to have a conversion experience. There's a book that was written by a historian called Mary Ryan. The name of the book is The Cradle of the Middle Class. And it talks about how one of the major motivators for women, mothers of young children, to participate in the Second Great Awakening was fear that their children would go to hell if they, didn't have a conversion experience. So you can see why women would be involved, but they also had leadership opportunities. They weren't necessarily preachers. Women preaching, still not really a very accepted feature of American Christianity. We haven't moved on that much in the 19th century from Anne Hutchinson. But women did set up female missionary societies and maternal organizations to go into working class communities and proselytize to working people. Number 2, there was an expansion of family-like ties, not actual family ties, but people would kind of choose people to hang around with on the basis of their common church membership. It was a way of knitting new bonds of community with other people. So this is a time period, for example, in which the YMCA, the Young Men's Christian Association, is founded. It was meant to be a place for young men moving into a new community to have somewhere where they could live and develop friendships with other Christian men and not fall into the traps of prostitution and gambling and drinking that were associated with cities in this time period. And then there was the emergence of some distinctly American forms of belief. So one of these sects was the Millerites. William Miller was a Baptist farmer and preacher who lived on the line between New York and Vermont. And this right here is an illustration of his views of the end of the world. He was a guy who was convinced that the signs of the times pointed to an early second coming of Christ. There was a lot of belief in this time period of what was called premillennial dispensationalism, which is a complicated way of saying people believed that the torments of Revelations would happen, and that would usher in the millennium of 1,000-year peace and Jesus Christ's coming back. So people were waiting for the end of the world, and they thought that it was imminent. Well, William Miller was one of these people, and he got the idea in the late 1830s that the end times were near. He set up a newspaper called The Signs of the Times, along with a newspaper editor named Joshua Himes. And over the next 3 years, the two of them distributed 4 million pieces of literature informing people that the end of the world was coming. They wanted to make sure that people knew. And by 1843, there were as many as 50,000 hardcore Millerites. The Millerites encouraged people to wind up their affairs, to, come to William Miller's farm for the end of the world, which was predicted to happen on October 22nd, 1843. So they all got together on William Miller's farm, and they waited for the end of the world to come, and it didn't. And so then William Miller went back to the drawing board in terms of his mathematical calculations and said, you know what, I did it wrong. The end of the world is actually going to happen on October 22nd, 1844. So everybody went home. They came back a year later, and they sat on a hillside, and they waited for the end of the world, and the world didn't end. So Miller, this was called the Great Disappointment. A lot of people fell away from Miller and his beliefs at this point, but Miller said, well, the end of the world is still coming. Maybe we can't figure out exactly when due to the math. He and some of his closest believers formed into the Advent Christian Association the following year, and eventually they became the Seventh-day Adventists. So that is where that particular belief system came from. Questions about the Millerites?
It's not really about the Millerites, but you're kind of talking about all these denominations that were forming in this time period. Was there
Sure.
another group that kind of thought that this was nonsense, or like they're drinking the Kool-Aid or something like that?
There were an increasing number of freethinkers in this time period who questioned all religion and thought that, that this was odd. And there were a lot of Catholics who were just kind of hunkered down because there was a very strong anti-Catholic leaning among a lot of these evangelical Protestant sects. But there wasn't a major like pushback in any way against the evangelical Protestantism. It's interesting. The United States is like a country that didn't have an official state religion, and yet in a way it has more of a state religion than many other countries that actually have a state religion. So it was highly pervasive in this period with almost nobody calling it out. Other questions? Okay, another distinctly American sect was the Latter-day Saints, or the Mormons. Joseph Smith was a young man who grew up in the burned-over district of Western New York in a very poor family. His family was so poor that members of his family had gotten in trouble for counterfeiting money. Some of them were searching for buried treasure. They were very, very evangelically Protestant. They were believers. They were very steeped in the Bible, but they were struggling to get along. And so Smith was working one day and had a vision. He had a vision of light brighter than the sun at noon, which told him that the world lived in sin. And then 2 years later, in 1823, he had a vision of golden plates buried in a hill on a nearby farm. So he would later say that these plates contained information that became the Book of Mormon, an additional book of the Bible. He dictated what was written on these plates from behind a curtain to a amanuensis who was like writing down what he said. And then ultimately the plates disappeared before anybody else could see them, but not before the Book of Mormon was written. All right, so this young man in the burned over district comes up with, or like produces, a piece of writing that he says is another book of the Bible. And this was immensely appealing to people in this time period because there was so much warring religiosity, so many different opinions on various aspects of religious belief. And here was extra information that people didn't have before. It answered perplexing questions of theology. It clarified obscure passages of the Bible. It carried the story of Jesus over into the New World. And it gave people a lot of certitude that they didn't have before, because it, said, okay, here's the answer to all the questions that you've had. So it was very appealing to Joseph Smith's neighbors. He began baptizing key followers. He got witnesses to sign depositions saying that they had seen the golden plates. And in April 1830, the Latter-day Saints Church was officially established. His followers found in Mormonism the notion of a pure kingdom of Christ in America, freedom from social turmoil. So keen were they to be free from social turmoil that they kept moving. They moved from New York to Ohio. They moved from Ohio to Missouri. And finally, they moved to Commerce, Illinois, where they were going to set up a kind of utopian community that is a fully planned city for LDS believers. They renamed it Nauvoo. And for 5 years, from 1839 to 44, that's where they lived. But in this time period, Joseph Smith had received a revelation from God telling him that the men in the church needed to take multiple wives, that was a part of the doctrine of the church. And at a time when women's behavior was extremely policed, and marriages were, the idea of morality was very strict around the question of marriage between one man and one woman. Joseph Smith and his brother Hiram were both shot to death by an angry mob. This resulted in Smith's successor, Brigham Young, quickly getting the Mormons out of Illinois, and they trekked all across to Utah, where they stopped. He said, "This is the place." It was beyond the reach of the United States government at that point. That was the reason that they settled on Utah. And there they could grow their church and practice their beliefs without being persecuted by other people. This right here is a picture of the Mormon temple in Nauvoo before it burned down. You can see it was a really nice public building. Most of the people that were living in Nauvoo at the time were living in pretty, I don't know, squalid's not the right word, but pretty poor conditions, but their temple was really well constructed. Okay. And then finally, reform movements. We're going to look into reform movements in the next lecture. We're going to talk about abolitionism and temperance and some of the sort of perfectionistic ideas about setting up communities that would be utopian communities. So that's going to be the subject for another lecture. But it should be noted that these reform movements directly follow on from the Second Great Awakening. People believed not only that religion was important, but also that they should change the world in ways that reflected their religious beliefs. That they could make life better, not just for believers, but for everybody in the country through kind of sharing their beliefs. So, questions about this?
Yeah, I thought the Mormons continue to move west because isn't there a pretty big Mormon town in Joshua Tree, California?